A medical student dared to spend the night in the abandoned hospital's morgue as part of a fraternity initiation, expecting only dust and silence. But as the night deepened, he discovered he wasn't alone. Something unseen was shifting the body drawers, and when he finally turned to leave, one of them slowly slid open on its own, revealing a corpse that hadn't been there before. In 1975, in Manila, a medical student named Ramon stood before the rusted double doors of an abandoned hospital's morgue. His breath was steady, his resolve unshaken, at least for now. Tonight was not an ordinary night. It was the night of his fraternity initiation. The challenge was simple in its conception, yet fiendishly complex in its execution. Spend one entire night alone in the morgue of a hospital long abandoned, a place steeped in both tragedy and urban legend. For decades, whispers had circulated among the fraternity members about a strange presence that haunted those decaying halls. It was said that if you listened closely, you could hear the soft scraping of metal and the faint echo of footsteps that did not belong to any living soul. Ramon, both curious and eager to prove his mettle, had accepted this perilous dare. The hospital, once a grand institution that boasted modern facilities and compassionate care, had fallen into ruin after a series of inexplicable events and financial misfortunes. Its corridors, now choked with the detritus of neglect, told stories of life, loss, and unanswered questions. As Ramon approached the building, the humid night air carried the scent of decay mixed with an undercurrent of antiseptic remnants, a grim reminder of the lives once cared for within these walls. Pushing open the heavy rusted door, Ramon stepped into a lobby that was almost unrecognizable from its former glory. Crumbling plaster and shattered glass punctuated the silence. The faint, ghostly glow of the moon seeped in through broken windows, creating long, eerie shadows that danced along the floor. Every step he took resonated in the emptiness, a stark reminder that he was far from the bustling life of a medical student in a busy hospital. Tonight, he was an outsider in a realm where the dead whispered secrets of a forgotten past. He made his way through narrow hallways lined with peeling wallpaper and faded photographs of smiling faces that now seemed to watch him with sorrow and accusation. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Ramon's heart pounded steadily in his chest as he finally arrived at the entrance to the morgue. The door was heavy, its surface scarred with scratches and dents from decades of neglect. He paused for a moment, steeling himself for what lay beyond, and pushed it open. Inside, the morgue was a small, sterile room that had long since lost its sense of order. Rows of old metal body drawers, each marked with numbers that had faded with time, lined the walls. The tiled floor, once gleaming with cleanliness, was now mottled with stains and dust. A single lantern lay on a nearby table, its weak flame flickering and casting uneven light over the room. Ramon set the lantern on a makeshift table and took a deep breath. He had come prepared with nothing but his determination, a notebook, and an inner resolve to endure whatever might come his way. At first, the silence was almost comforting. Ramon settled into a corner, leaning his back against a cold concrete wall. He tried to calm his racing mind by recalling his studies in anatomy and pathology, subjects that had always grounded him in the logic of science. Yet, as minutes turned into hours, an unsettling sensation began to creep over him. It was as if he were not alone. The slight rustle of fabric, the distant echo of soft footsteps, these small anomalies nagged at his consciousness. As midnight drew near, the oppressive weight of solitude grew heavier. Ramon tried to convince himself that the eerie sensations were mere tricks of the mind, products of fear and isolation. But then, a sound shattered the fragile calm, a deep, guttural scrape, reminiscent of metal dragging against metal, reverberated through the morgue. Ramon's eyes snapped open. His pulse quickened as he scanned the dimly lit room. One of the drawers, the one closest to him, had shifted ever so slightly, barely an inch, yet unmistakable in its movement. His breath caught in his throat. With a trembling hand, he reached out toward the drawer, half expecting it to be nothing more than a result of his imagination. But as his fingers neared the cold metal, he felt a chill that went far beyond the room's temperature. He withdrew his hand quickly, his mind racing to rationalize what he had seen. "It's just an old, rusted mechanism," he muttered under his breath, trying to dismiss the terror rising within him. But deep down, he knew that this explanation was feeble in the face of what he was beginning to experience. Time seemed to slow as Ramon sat there, listening. The silence that followed was thick and unnerving, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water and the occasional groan of the old building settling into its decay. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, another noise emerged, a slow, deliberate tapping, as if unseen fingers were drumming against metal. Ramon's heart pounded louder. The sound seemed to echo from the far wall, where the drawers stood in eerie formation like sentinels guarding secrets of the past. With each passing minute, his unease deepened. He could not shake the feeling that eyes were watching him, that the very air vibrated with a silent warning. Compelled by a mix of terror and determination, Ramon stood up and moved toward the source of the sound. His legs felt weak, yet he pressed on, each step an act of defiance against the mounting dread. He reached a drawer marked with a number so faded it was barely legible. The closer he got, the more he noticed details he had previously overlooked. A thin layer of dust, disturbed in a pattern that suggested recent movement. Taking a deep breath, Ramon placed a shaking hand on the cool metal and slowly pulled the drawer open. The creak of metal on metal was loud in the stillness, echoing off the walls like a mournful cry. But inside, the drawer was empty. Relief, however, was short-lived. As he closed the drawer, Ramon could not ignore the sensation that something had been waiting inside, a presence that had stirred when the drawer was moved. His mind raced with questions. What could have caused that movement? Had he really seen something? Or was it merely the product of an overactive imagination fueled by the legends of this forsaken place? Unable to shake the gnawing feeling of dread, Ramon returned to his corner. He tried to sit, but sleep eluded him as his thoughts spiraled into dark possibilities. He remembered stories he had heard from upperclassmen, tales of strange occurrences and inexplicable phenomena within the hospital's walls. Some said that the building was cursed, that it was a gateway between the living and the dead. Others claimed that the spirits of those who had perished under mysterious circumstances still roamed the corridors, seeking solace or revenge. In his solitude, Ramon began to reflect on his own life. He had chosen medicine not only for the promise of knowledge, but also for the hope of healing, a hope that seemed so distant tonight. Memories of his childhood, when the world was simpler and the shadows were just playful shapes, now clashed violently with the grim reality he faced. The weight of expectation from his family, his professors, and his fraternity pressed upon him, and the initiation challenge felt like an unnecessary torment. Yet, he had agreed. The thought of backing out now was an affront to his pride and his future among his peers. As the night deepened, the unnatural stillness of the morgue began to warp into something more sinister. The sound of the tapping resumed, louder this time, accompanied by a series of soft, deliberate clicks that seemed to follow a rhythm. Ramon's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of these sounds. Each drawer seemed to participate in this unsettling symphony, their metal surfaces creaking and groaning as if alive. His skin prickled, and a bead of sweat trickled down his temple despite the chill in the air. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and mounting terror, Ramon decided to explore further. He stepped away from his corner and walked slowly along the row of drawers. His lantern's weak light revealed nothing but the cold, unyielding metal of each compartment. But then, As he neared one drawer at the far end of the room, he saw something that made his blood run cold, a thin, shadowy outline that seemed to shift and pulse at the very edge of his vision. For a moment, he questioned whether his eyes were playing tricks on him. The outline faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving him with a profound sense of loss and regret. As he paused, Ramon recalled a story his mentor once told him, a story of a doctor who had encountered inexplicable events in a similar setting. That doctor had spoken of a malevolent presence that preyed on the vulnerabilities of those who dared to enter the realm of death. Ramon shivered, feeling that the legacy of that tale was coming to life around him. The legends that had once seemed so distant and abstract were now all too real, manifesting in the shifting shadows and the haunting sounds echoing in the morgue. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Ramon's mind teetered between skepticism and fear. Every small sound, every slight movement of the drawers, gnawed at his sanity. At times, he attempted to focus on rational thoughts, reminding himself that he was a man of science, that logic and reason should prevail over superstition. But the atmosphere was insidious, undermining his confidence with every unexplained phenomenon. Then, as the clock neared the witching hour, an event unfolded that would shatter any remaining semblance of normalcy. Ramon, having gathered the courage to return to the drawer he had earlier inspected, felt a sudden and inexplicable urge to look again. His hand, still trembling, reached out for the cold handle. This time, however, as he pulled the drawer open, the sound that emanated from its opening was not the familiar creak of old metal. It was accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible moan, as if the very walls were exhaling a long-held secret. Inside the drawer lay something that defied explanation. There, nestled in the darkness, was a body, an arrangement of limbs and features that seemed both familiar and alien. The corpse was unnervingly still, its pallid skin stretched taut over a frame that resembled a medical student's physique. Ramon's breath hitched as he stared into the vacant eyes of the figure. For a moment, time froze. The room, the creaks of the drawers, even his own pounding heart all faded into insignificance in the face of this ghastly sight. Slowly, as if in a macabre dance, the corpse's eyes began to flutter open. They rolled in a way that was agonizingly deliberate, as if each movement was weighted by centuries of despair. Ramon could not tear his gaze away. The figure's mouth parted slightly, and in that silent moment, the faintest semblance of a smile appeared, a grin that was as chilling as it was inhuman. The sight was so surreal that Ramon questioned whether he was witnessing a nightmare born of exhaustion or a true defiance of nature. Panic surged through him. With a scream lodged in his throat, he recoiled, his body convulsing as he staggered backward. In that split second, the reality of his situation crashed over him. This was no mere initiation prank. This was something far darker, a manifestation of the inexplicable, a harbinger of doom that defied all scientific explanation. Driven by raw terror, Ramon bolted for the door. His lantern slipped from his grasp and shattered on the floor, plunging the room into darkness. The oppressive blackness was punctuated only by the sound of his ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of his heart. He could feel the presence of the figure closing in behind him, a predatory force that seemed to materialize from the very shadows. As he raced through the narrow corridors of the derelict hospital, every creak of the floorboards, every distant echo of movement intensified his dread. The halls of the abandoned hospital were a labyrinth of decay. Ramon ran blindly, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors as the building itself seemed to conspire against him. The oppressive atmosphere, laden with the stench of mildew and rust, made every breath a struggle. He could hear the phantom sounds of whispers and rustling, as if unseen entities were closing in on him. With every turn, his mind reeled, and he was forced to confront the possibility that he was not the only one navigating these haunted passageways. In a desperate bid for escape, Ramon burst through a door that led to a long-forgotten hallway. The corridor stretched into darkness, its walls lined with shattered mirrors that reflected distorted images of his terrified face. As he ran, he caught glimpses of movement in the peripheral shadows that darted and shifted, as if mocking his attempts to flee. Every sound was magnified: the clatter of his shoes, the distant drip of water, and that relentless, inexplicable scratching that seemed to follow him. At one point, Ramon paused in a narrow alcove, his back pressed against a cold, damp wall. His heart thundered in his chest as he tried to steady his breathing. He thought back to his training, to the countless hours he had spent studying the human body and its ailments. Yet, in this moment, all that knowledge seemed futile. He was confronted with a force that defied all explanation of force, that had reached out from the depths of death itself to claim him. The minutes stretched into an eternity as Ramon tried to navigate the maze-like corridors. Every turn led him deeper into the building's labyrinth of despair. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, and the oppressive silence was intermittently broken by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the soft echo of footsteps that were not his own. In one dimly lit corner, he stumbled upon an old medical records room. Papers were strewn across the floor, yellowed with age, and in the midst of the debris was an open ledger with handwritten notes detailing the hospital's most tragic case accounts of inexplicable deaths and mysterious disappearances that had plagued the institution long before its abandonment. Driven by the need for answers, Ramon pressed on, determined to piece together the mystery even as fear clawed at his sanity. The hospital itself seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its decaying walls whispering secrets of pain and regret. Every step he took was accompanied by a feeling of being observed by unseen eyes, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay and despair. The more he ventured, the more the building revealed its hidden history of doctors who had pushed the boundaries of science, of patients whose cries for help had been silenced by ambition, and of a darkness that refused to fade even in the light of day. At length, Ramon found himself at a set of ornate, iron-bound doors that led to what appeared to be an old chapel attached to the hospital. The chapel, though long abandoned, retained vestiges of its former sanctity-stained glass windows that cast fractured patterns on the floor, and a heavy, carved altar that dominated the room. Here, in this eerie sanctuary of sorrow, Ramon paused to collect his thoughts. The weight of his experiences bore down on him, and he felt a deep, gnawing terror that he had never known before. In the chapel's silence, memories of his past flooded back. He remembered the days when he was a child, attending church services filled with light and hope, when the idea of death was as distant and abstract as the stars in the night sky. Now, confronted with the harsh reality of mortality and the specter of an ancient evil, those memories seemed both a comfort and a cruel reminder of what had been lost. Ramon sank to his knees, his mind a chaotic jumble of scientific reasoning and raw primal fear. It was in that moment of vulnerability that a faint sound reached his ears, a sound that was unmistakably human. It was a soft murmur, like a whispered prayer, coming from the far end of the chapel. With his heart pounding in his ears, Ramon rose unsteadily and moved toward the sound. The beam of his salvaged lantern illuminated a figure standing near a shattered window. The figure was draped in tattered robes, its face hidden in shadow. Ramon's breath caught as he realized that the figure bore an uncanny resemblance to the corpse he had seen earlier, a mirror image of his own form, yet older, with eyes that held centuries of sorrow and malice. The spectral figure raised its head slowly, and for a long, agonizing moment, their eyes met. In that silent exchange, Ramon felt a surge of terror unlike anything he had ever experienced. The figure's eyes were deep pools of despair, and in them, Ramon saw not just his own reflection, but the faces of countless souls trapped within the building's cursed history. The figure, opened its mouth, and in a voice that seemed to echo from beyond time, it spoke, "You cannot escape what has been set in motion." Before Ramon could react, the figure melted back into the shadows, leaving him with a mind reeling from questions and fears. He stumbled back into the corridor, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and dread. Who or what was this apparition? And what did it mean by what has been set in motion? The answers lay buried in the dark recesses of the hospital's past, and Ramon knew that if he was to survive the night, he would have to confront the secrets that lurked within these walls. The remainder of the night became a blur of horror and disjointed time. Ramon wandered through the decaying halls, each room revealing fragments of a grim history. Faded photographs of patients with vacant eyes, personal belongings left behind in a hurry, and handwritten notes scrawled on walls in desperate script. At one point, he discovered a hidden room tucked away behind a false wall. Inside, the remnants of medical equipment lay in disarray, and in the center of the room was a rusted operating table stained with dark, unidentifiable marks. The sight sent a fresh wave of nausea through him, and he could not shake the feeling that he had intruded upon a sacred place of suffering. As dawn approached, Ramon's mind was a battlefield of terror and rationality. Every unexplained sound, every shifting shadow, had chipped away at his once steadfast belief in science. Now, he was forced to acknowledge that there were forces in this world that defied logical explanation, forces that thrived in the liminal space between life and death. Exhausted and emotionally drained, he found a quiet corner in what remained of the hospital's library, a room filled with dusty books and decaying manuscripts. He sank into a worn armchair and allowed himself a moment of rest, even as the building creaked and groaned around him. In the dim light of early morning, as the first hints of sunlight struggled to penetrate the grime-covered windows, Ramon began to piece together the fragments of the night's terror. He recalled the spectral figure in the chapel, the haunted eyes of the corpse in the drawer, and the eerie tag that had appeared on his wrist. Each detail formed part of a tapestry of horror that defied simple explanation. The morgue tag, bearing his own name, was perhaps the most chilling of all, an indication that the forces at work had somehow intertwined his fate with the dark history of the hospital. Questions swirled in his mind. Was he merely a victim of an overactive imagination fueled by fear and isolation? Or had he truly encountered a malevolent force that reached out from the depths of death? And if so, what did it want with him? The more he pondered these questions, the deeper his sense of foreboding became. It was as if the very act of seeking answers only served to draw him further into the darkness. Unable to shake the lingering terror, Ramon resolved that he would leave the hospital at first light. Yet, as he prepared to make his escape, the building itself seemed to protest. Doors that he had passed earlier were now inexplicably sealed. Hallways that once led to the exit ended in impenetrable walls of decay. The oppressive silence was broken by a series of soft, measured knocks that echoed through the corridor's sound that, to his horror, resembled the steady beating of a heart. The realization struck him with paralyzing clarity. The hospital was not finished with him yet. Its malignant presence had claimed him, and escape was far more complicated than simply walking out a door. Desperation turned to frantic determination as Ramon retraced his steps. With every turn, the building seemed to rearrange itself, as if guided by an unseen hand intent on keeping him within its grasp. His mind raced with the possibility that the initiation challenge was a trap, set not merely as a test of courage, but as a right to bind him to the legacy of the damned. In his flight, he began to hear a persistent, echoing refrain, a soft murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was as if the voices of the long departed were speaking directly to him, warning him, pleading with him to understand the terrible cost of trespassing in this domain of the dead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ramon stumbled upon a set of heavy doors. that led to the hospital's main exit. With trembling hands, he pushed them open and was met by the cool embrace of the early morning air. Gasping for breath, he fled into the street, leaving behind the cursed building that had imprinted its horror upon his soul. Outside, the world was strangely indifferent. Life went on, oblivious to the dark secrets that lay hidden behind those decaying walls. In the days that followed, Ramon found no solace in the light of day. The memory of that night haunted him relentlessly. His friends in the fraternity dismissed his account as a product of his overactive imagination, attributing the terrifying events to a combination of stress and exhaustion. Yet Ramon knew what he had experienced was real. At night, when the city fell silent and the memories of that cursed morgue resurfaced, he would awaken drenched in sweat, his mind filled with images of shifting drawers and hollow, accusing eyes. He spent long hours poring over old hospital records and local legends, searching for any clue that might explain the inexplicable. Among the yellowed pages of a forgotten journal, he uncovered references to a series of experimental procedures performed in the 1960s, saw a time when ambition and desperation drove a cadre of doctors to explore the boundaries between life and death. The entries spoke of patients who had vanished without a trace, of mysterious deaths that had been hastily covered up, and of a shadow that seemed to linger in the corners of the morgue long after the bodies were interred. The more Ramon read, the more he realized that his own fate might have been sealed long before he had ever set foot in that accursed place. Haunted by recurring nightmares and plagued by visions of the spectral figure, Ramon's life began to unravel. He found himself isolated from friends and colleagues, tormented by the constant fear that the darkness was following him even into the light of day. His once rational mind now grappled with the possibility that he was part of a larger, unfathomable design in which the line between the living and the dead had been irrevocably blurred. In a final, desperate attempt to reclaim his sanity, Ramon returned to the ruins of the hospital one last time. He believed that confronting the source of his torment might free him from the relentless grip of the past. Under the cover of night, he slipped back into the building, his steps measured and deliberate. The corridors welcomed him like an old malevolent friend, the silence punctuated by distant, indistinct whispers. This time, he moved with a grim determination, intent on uncovering every secret that had haunted him. In the derelict corridors, Ramon discovered a room that he had missed during his first frantic escape, a small chamber filled with relics of the hospital's forgotten history. Dust-covered medical instruments lay scattered on a table, and on the wall hung a faded portrait of a stern-looking doctor whose eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. As he studied the portrait, Ramon felt a chill run down his spine. Was this the man responsible for those horrific experiments? Had he been the architect of the terror that now clung to Ramon like a curse? In that moment, the room grew inexplicably cold, and a presence seemed to fill the space. Ramon's heart pounded as he felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him. A low murmur rose in his ears, a soft, rhythmic chant that resonated with a primordial power. Unable to resist the pull of this dark energy, he began to search the room for any clue that might reveal the truth. Hidden in a dusty drawer, he found a leather-bound journal. Its pages, brittle with age, contained the confessions of a man who had once walked the thin line between genius and madness. The journal spoke of experiments that sought to bind the souls of the departed to the physical realm, of rituals performed in secret, and of a relentless force that fed on the fear of those who dared to challenge the natural order. Ramon read on, each word searing itself into his memory. The journal recounted the final days of the hospital, when patients began to vanish under mysterious circumstances, and the halls echoed with the cries of the damned. The doctor, whose portrait now loomed over him, had recorded his descent into darkness, confessing that he had unleashed something that could not be contained, a shadow that lived in the spaces between life and death. As Ramon absorbed the horrifying revelations, a single phrase leapt from the page. Once the shadow is awakened, it will seek the living to complete its circle. In that instant, the pieces of the puzzle began to align, and Ramon understood with bone-deep clarity that his fate had been intertwined with that of the hospital long before he had ever stepped through its doors. Tears mixed with sweat as he clutched the journal to his chest, a symbol of both his quest for truth and the unbearable burden of that truth. He realized that his presence in the morgue had not been an accident, but a meticulously orchestrated event of final initiation into a legacy of horror and despair that would forever haunt his soul. With the journal as his only solace, he left the chamber and wandered once more through the labyrinthine corridors, the echoes of the past whispering secrets in his ear. At last, as dawn crept over Manila, Ramon emerged from the ruins a broken man. The once proud medical student was now a husk of his former self, his eyes haunted by visions of shifting shadows and the unyielding specter of death. In the weeks that followed, he sought solace in the mundane routines of everyday life, but nothing could dispel the darkness that had taken root in his heart. The morgue, with its relentless legacy, had claimed him, even as the hospital was eventually demolished and replaced by new developments. Ramon found that the memory of that cursed night would never fade. In quiet moments, when the world fell silent and the night air grew heavy, he would feel a cold, inexorable presence by his side, a reminder that the shadow he had encountered was not confined to the ruins of an abandoned building. It had followed him into his dreams, into his waking hours, a constant, insidious reminder that some horrors are eternal. Now, years later, whispers persist among those who dare to speak of the events of that fateful night. Some claim that if you stand near the spot where the hospital once stood, you can still hear the faint sound of metal drawers shifting in the darkness. Others insist that the shadow of the morgue has not moved on, that it lingers on the fringes of our reality, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to cross its path. Ramon's story has become a cautionary tale among medical students and those who study the arcane intersections of life and death. His experience stands as a testament to the fact that some boundaries are never meant to be crossed, that the pursuit of forbidden knowledge can exact a terrible price. The morgue tag he discovered that night, with his own name inscribed upon it, remains a symbol of that irreversible memento moment when the line between the living and the dead was irrevocably blurred. Even now, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city of Manila seems to hold its breath, a question lingers in the minds of those who have heard his tale. Did Ramon truly escape the grasp of the morgue's dark legacy, or does his spirit remain bound to the remnants of a place that defies time and reason? For some, the answer is shrouded in mystery that continues to grow with each retelling of his harrowing ordeal. And so, the legend of the shadow in the morgue endures, a chilling reminder of the night when one man's quest for bravery opened a door that was never meant to be opened. Do you believe that Ramon ever truly left that place? Or does his restless spirit now wander the abandoned corridors, a ghost forever entwined with the darkness of the past? The answer, like the secrets of that night, remains hidden in the shadows, waiting, watching, and beckoning you to uncover the truth. Comment your thoughts, share your theories, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying challenges are not those we face in the realm of the living, but those that lie just beyond the veil of death.